Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari. This is Great Big History. Our continuing saga of History 150, Episode 13, Coups and Revolts. Let's break some stuff. So you say you want a revolution. Hey, you know. Hey, well, you can't do it alone. John Lennon needed Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo. A revolution is a wholesale change of political, economic, and social systems. And you can't do it alone. You can't change that much. A revolution, though, is not a coup or revolt. And that's really what we're going to be talking about in this episode. We'll do revolutions next. So what is a coup? A coup is a sudden attempt to overthrow the government by either government elites or a military organization. They are small in scale. They are concentrated to elites. It's usually conservative because the main goal of the coup is to maintain the system. A self-coup is an attempt to stay in power beyond the constitutionally acceptable limits. So, a coup is usually a small group near power. They're elites, and they don't like where things are going. And so it's usually conservative in nature because the goal of the coup is not to change everything. It's to maintain most of the stuff, but just change who's in power, who benefits from controlling the government or the leadership of the organization. A revolt is a demonstrable, often violent attempt to force the authoritative system to change. So here we have Liberty Leading the People by Delacroix, which is not everyone, but a lot of people think this is the French Revolution. It's not. It's the July Revolution of 1830, made famous in Les Miserables. Also, I have a picture of the Pilgrimage of Grace. These were not revolutions, meaning it wanted to change everything, but it wanted the government to change. It wanted to force a change in the system. So revolts are large in scale, where coups are small. Coups could be like 10 people. Revolts are large, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. They have accepted leaders who have the authority to make demands, conduct negotiations, and even order violence. A protest, on the other hand, is a mass gathering that seeks to alert the authoritative system to the need of change. The protest doesn't necessarily have accepted leaders who can conduct negotiations, much less order violence. Kind of the thing we saw most recently with protests was the Black Lives Matter protests, which were all over the country, or even the hands-off protests that just happened last week. I don't know who's leading that. In theory, there's an organization. I don't know who the people are. There was a Black Lives Matter organization. Do you know who those leaders were? I don't know. Right? Did they conduct any negotiations? No. So a protest is more of a mass gathering of emotion that seeks to alert the authoritative system, the king or the government, that things need to change, that we're pissed off. So leadership in a coup. You want to be a leader of a coup? You want to take over the government? You got to have authority. You need to have a secondary basis of power. the death of Stalin, we have General Zhukov. He led the army. He was famous. He was a hero of the Soviet Union. He defeated Hitler and the Nazis. He had a secondary source of power he could rely upon. There's people he could call on and say, I need your help. Follow me. And they could do so. You have to have some form of authority. Someone has to back you up if you're going to try to become the new government. If you're going to knock off the leader, if you're going to replace the leader, because there's going to be other groups that are going to try to do the same thing. So this is why the security forces matter a lot, especially in coups, the army, the national police, the information services. This is why everyone thinks the CIA is, killed Kennedy. Not everyone, obviously, but why people would think the CIA kills Kennedy, because the NKVD in the Soviet Union did commit assassinations as well and arrested people. Or you need an ethnic group, a religious group, leadership to the of kin, leadership kin. You have Richard III in Shakespeare, Prospero's brother, Hamlet's uncle. Hamlet's uncle takes over because he's the brother of the king, and then he marries the queen. So we see coups a lot in Shakespeare. But you need a group that supports you, or a group that has the ability to commit violence. The army, the national police, the information services. You need authority. Then you need decisive action. You have to pick the right time, and then you have to do it. If you waffle, if you wait, you'll get pushed aside. You'll miss it. Violence against resistance from government or other power groups. You have to be willing to commit violence. Coups are very often violent acts. And even if you don't commit violence, you have to be able to threaten to make the other side think you could commit violence. You also need calmness, which is in direct opposition to the next two things we talked about, the decisive action and the violence. The calmness, you need to present legitimacy to the people to stop them from uprising. Because you're going to commit a coup, you have no legitimacy. You weren't the previous leader. No one put you in charge. No one agreed that you should be in charge. You're taking over by either replacing the leader or entering a vacuum that a leader who probably has just died, say the death of Stalin, and you want to be in control rather than somebody else. But nobody selected you. So you need to present to people that you can run the show and it won't disrupt their lives. Because if you get a revolt on top of your coup, you could end up with a revolution. You could end up with the whole system come tumbling down. We saw this with the end of the Soviet Union, where a bunch of conservatives arrested Gorbachev. And it was a coup. They arrested Gorbachev. They were going to take over. And then what were they met with? Massive revolts, massive uprisings, protests in the major cities. The most famous of which was led by Boris Yeltsin. And that was essentially the death knell of the Soviet Union right there. The conservatives lost. They had decisive action. They were willing to commit violence, but they didn't shoot Gorbachev, but they arrested him. But they couldn't convince the people they had a legitimacy. And they were met with revolts. People thought by them taking over, their lives were going to get worse. The system was going to make their lives worse. And so they revolted. Aspects of a modern coup. So, okay, you're gonna lead a coup. You're gonna be decisive. You're gonna project calmness. How? in what manner, right? You're going to commit violence. How? So what do you need? What's the aspects of a modern coup? You need to control the media. This is your calmness. You need to tell people you're in charge and not to worry. So if you have media, you have propaganda, you have allies in the newspapers, televisions, or radio, you need TikTok on your side or Twitter. You need a way of projecting your calmness. 2, you need to control the economic levers so that the markets don't freak out, so that the dollar doesn't collapse in its value. You need to make sure that the economy stays at least stable, because if it goes into the pooper, you're in trouble because people will blame you. 3, you have to capture the administration, the different departments of state, the things that run things. The State Department, the Pentagon, but also the Social Security Office and Medicare, at least in the United States, because you need to keep sending those checks out. People don't get their Social Security check, you've lost your legitimacy. You need the loyalty of the military, or at least the neutrality of it. Even if it's not going to actively get engaged, it at least needs to stay out. And then you need legitimacy from the people. They have to accept your right to take over. And this is kind of why you don't get coups in democratic systems. You need support. You need quick action. Many times you need a crisis that will help, that will project, people will go, yes, we need to make a change. You need little resistance. If there's a lot of resistance, the whole system could collapse, and that's how you get a civil war. Coups usually lead to more coups as factions fight over control. It helps if you're first. It doesn't mean you're going to win. You have to crush. And this is where a lot of people get arrested afterwards and then get executed, get shot in, the side of a road underneath a bridge, because you have to be able to crush, this is your violence, people who might want to replace you. If you can't do that, these other factions, these other groups could lead to fights over control. We see this in the Roman Empire. We see this during the 3rd century crisis. Different generals just warred against each other. One general would win, and 6 months later, another general would lead a revolt of their troops, march down to Rome, kill the emperor who had just won, replace him, become the new emperor, but then some other general who hated that guy from back in the day revolts, takes his army, marches down to Italy, marches down to Rome, and fights a battle and either loses or wins. And so democracies don't fall to coups because they have democratic institutions of resistance, elections, courts, political parties, a non-political military. So we see a good example of this is South Korea, the South Korea self-coup of 2024, where the president announced martial law. And one general or colonel said, I will join you, and got his troops to move, but none of the rest of the South Korean military moved. And what happened? The media, the other political parties, the courts all declared the president out of line for his coup. He wanted to stay in power longer. So he declared a crisis, declared martial law, and nobody took that seriously. Why? Because South Korea is a modern democracy. And my argument would be too many people remembered when South Korea back in the 80s, the 70s and the 80s was a dictatorship, was under martial law, and they didn't want to go back. Whereas my argument about China is the opposite. lots of people in China remember being poor. And now they're not poor. And so they're willing to accept a non-democratic political system in order not to be poor. You have this issue that you're dealing with followers, and you got to get followers to accept you. And the South Korean president flew right in the face of that. He declared martial law as if it was 1978, and it wasn't. There's 2 generations of South Koreans who never lived under martial law, and the generation and a half that are still here that did live under martial law didn't like it, which is why you have a democracy. So the entire thing was like failed from the start. What about leadership in a revolt? Revolts are more widespread. Game of Thrones, several revolts, right? You have King Robert dies. King Robert dies, there's no revolts. Now, King Robert led a revolt to overthrow the Targaryens and become king. And what happened is he dies under mysterious circumstances, but he dies. And then, in theory, his son's going to take over. But then there's a series of murders that set in place revolts. And meanwhile, there's Daenerys over in the east who is in rebellion because she is of the old house. So she wants to regain her family's place. So she was always in revolt. So a revolt is more widespread. If you watch Game of Thrones, there's thousands of troops on the move all the time. 5, 6, 7 different armies. These could be thousands of individuals. The Pilgrimage of Grace had 50,000 people. Now that's an estimate. It's probably not accurate, but it was a number so large it overwhelmed any force that was sent against it. So you need authority from the previous regime and some charisma. People have to look to you. They have to like you. And so Daenerys is not only has the charisma that the Dothraki, that the nomads like her, they accept her as a leader, but she also has the authority of the name. She's a Targaryen. She has the silver hair. She has the aspects that people look to for the old regime. Robb Stark, same thing. He's a Stark. His father was Ned, the most honorable man in the world. He's got charisma. People like him. People want to follow him. He says, we're going to march against King Joffrey. And people say, yes, let's go. So people have to look to you early. So what we get in a revolt is the rise of minor lords, nobility, influential people in society who aren't part of the elite. They're just outside. They're not in the inner circle. But they're influential enough, and so they're made into leaders. Daenerys is the last of the old royal family, the wife of a horse lord, the mother of dragons. Robb Stark is heir to one of the great houses of Westeros with kin connections to the other houses, but Robb Stark is not in the capital. He is not a member of the cabinet like his father was. He's not married to the new royal family. So revolts have limited goals compared to revolutions. So there's a clarity of mission. Pilgrimage of Grace in the 1530s wants to end the Reformation in England. Now you could say, well, that's a little silly because the king wanted the Reformation. But it's a clarity of mission. They don't want to overthrow Henry VIII. They don't want to kill him and his family and Anne Boleyn or whoever else, whoever was the queen in 1836, Jane Seymour. They're not looking to wipe out the other royal families. They want the Reformation to end. So what's the goal of protests and revolts? It's to get authority figures to change policy. The Boston Tea Party wanted to change royal economic policy. There was a monopoly and a tax on tea, and they wanted to end that. All of the revolts against Henry VIII are to end the Reformation, to go back to the Catholic Church. So it's to get the authority. It's a way of conducting a poll. We are mad and we want you to change. 2, it is to take a disenfranchised group seriously, because there's not another way for them to voice their displeasure. So you have Democrats protesting in 2016. They don't have power in the Senate. They don't have power in the House. They don't have the presidency after Donald Trump's election. And so you get marches, the Women's March, the Black Lives Matter marches in 2020. They don't have the power to change things. So they're voicing their displeasure. They're saying, you might not be thinking about us, but you better. 3, to bring attention to issues among both the authority and the wider population, to say to the rest of the people, we're here. There's an old gay pride parade chant. We're here, we're queer, get used to us. It was a chant during protests. It was a chant during parades. And it was a way of saying to the authority figures, we're here and we are a group that demands political recognition. But it's also to the wider population. We exist. You can't ignore us. We are a population. So, thus the Women's March in 2016, the Black Lives Matter March in 2020, is to show that these groups exist. And so they start in one place and then they spread as the wider population connects to them. So why do revolts fail? Like every revolt against Henry VIII fails. The Pilgrimage of Grace fails. The Black Lives Matter fails. The Women's March fails. Why? Because many times they're not willing to use violence against authority. Black Lives Matter was unwilling to push past the police and seize the White House. The Pilgrimage of Grace didn't really want to overthrow Henry VIII. So could you stop him from doing the Reformation? No, because he wanted to do it. He needed the money, he needed the grounds, so he did it. It was in his interest. So unless the Pilgrimage of Grace was willing to march down to London, capture the king himself, and possibly execute him, it was always going to fail. It was never going to win. The Black Lives Matter protests could keep protesting and being in the streets for a long time, but unless the political system wanted to actually change, nothing was going to happen. So what did they do? They just put up bigger fences to keep the Black Lives Matter protesters out of the White House. Could they have pushed past? Yeah, especially in the early days. I watched it. I watched the police and especially the prison guards who were brought in by the Justice Department to beat up protesters. I watched them. They don't know how close they came to death. They really don't. They took out their batons and they went whacking away, but they didn't do so in an organized manner. They didn't do so as a phalanx, shoulder to shoulder. They just kind of went whacking away. And you're like, if the protesters moved forward, they would have run over them. There were so many more protesters. If the protesters didn't go backwards, if they went forwards, they would have run right over those guards. They would have run right over those, they weren't even the D.C. police, and they could have been on the White House grounds easy. They just had to push forward. There were so many of them. Simple wait. But they didn't want to attack the White House. They were hoping that just yelling would get them change. And that's the failure of most revolts. The Pilgrimage of Grace does the same thing. It's not serious in its use of violence. Wait till we get to revolutions. Revolutions use violence, and a lot of it. 2, a lot of revolts don't really have a leader. And the leaders come from that, we just said, that minor elite, that those influential people who are just outside. They don't really want to overthrow the system. Robb Stark does not want a democracy. Robb Stark is mad at Joffrey, King Joffrey. So maybe he wants to overthrow King Joffrey, but Robb Stark doesn't want to have a democracy. He wants to be Lord of the North, King of the North, which is what his sister will become, Queen of the North, right? Which is a weird ending, that she becomes Queen of the North, but her brother is King of the Seven Kingdoms. It really makes no sense. But be that as it may, they don't want to overthrow the system. So the mass of people are not organized, disciplined, or invested. They want change, but they don't have anyone who naturally can organize, discipline, or invest meaning into them. Spartacus is the exception that proves the rule, because Spartacus does. Spartacus leads a revolt of gladiators in a gladiator training school that then becomes a symbol to freeing slaves. And so if you hated the slavery of the Roman Republic, you joined Spartacus. Spartacus was an ex-military officer. He had some Roman training, or at least he had he was a Thracian, so he was in the Thracian army, but he also probably had some kind of Roman training. And this is a guy who then could organize and discipline a bunch of regular slaves into an organized group and then lead them. So the fact that he holds out, he destroys several Roman legions. Nobody does that. Hannibal was the last guy who did that until Spartacus, who destroyed Roman legions in Italy. Think about that. The Roman legions don't lose. Think about that. The Romans Pompey conquered the East, right? The Roman generals are conquering the East, the Eastern Greek kingdoms, big empires with armies. And who destroys Roman legions in Italy? Hannibal, one of the greatest military generals of all time, and Spartacus, the slave leader of a freedmen army, of a revolt. That's insane. But why? Because it wasn't just a bunch of ex-slaves protesting that they didn't want to be slaves. It was actually a group of people organized into a group that had a meaning. They were not going to be slaves again. So consequently, there are limits that hem in the choice of action. If you don't want to overthrow the King of England, you're suddenly left with not a lot of choices. When the King of England says, okay, let's negotiate, you kind of have to say yes, because you don't have any other options. And so he says, I'll pause the Reformation for a year, you go home. And you say, okay, well, we got the pause. I guess that's okay. And then once your army goes away, which it has to because you can't really feed it, and these guys are not making any money, so they're going to need to make some money somewhere along the way, you have that problem. So on Revolts, there's really not a lot they can do. I mean, think about January 6th. The protesters ransacked the Senate. They ransacked the Congress building, right? And they went home at the end of the day when President Trump told them to go home. And a couple hours later, the Senate did exactly what the protesters didn't want them to do. Like, exactly. They showed up and they certified the election. So, but what were the January 6th rebels going to do? They didn't want to overthrow democracy. They wanted President Trump to stay in power. But they weren't going to like murder all the senators. I mean, we didn't see this happen, so it's they didn't get a chance, so it's good that we didn't see it. But they didn't want to overthrow like the entire system. They didn't attack the Supreme Court. They attacked one building. And so once they broke up, once they went home, once they went back to their hotels, the system kicked back into gear. They lost. Now, here's the interesting thing. Trying to save the system against the revolt actually gives authority leaders more power to take even more dramatic actions. So Henry VIII comes out kind of with more power out of the revolts. Like, he sees the revolts and goes, I have to do the Reformation now, because I need the money to raise an army that can put down these revolts if they happen again. And so the consequence of the revolt is that it could be the opposite of what the revolt wanted, where the system actually gets more powerful. It doesn't do the changes that they want. And so that's what we have, coups and revolts. You have to act fast. You have to be decisive. You have to be willing to commit violence. You got to be able to shoot somebody by the side of the road under a bridge. Arrest your enemies. Right? But you also need to know what you want. And you have to know how to get what you want and how to maintain it, how to force the system to change. Because otherwise, the moment you stop pressuring, the moment you take your knee, I don't want to use that example. The moment you stop having an advantageous position, because the only reason they're negotiating with you is suddenly you are it's necessary to negotiate with you. The moment you give up that advantage, especially in revolts, the system kicks right back in, as if it never happened. So you have to be able to see the future. You have to be able to see how the chessboard will play. Because if you don't get what you need, like the Pilgrimage of Grace leaders are all arrested and murdered later on. You know, Robb Stark is assassinated. Lots of people who lead revolts are killed by the system they negotiated with. So you have to be decisive, but you also have to see the future. You got to play the full game. And this is why revolts don't necessarily work. In our next video, we're going to talk about revolutions, which are way bigger, but also because they're way bigger, and because they want to change everything, they also work. They also happen. So thank you. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye. Be safe.